So you're trying to figure out watercolor, and I bet you're having a lot of fun with that. You're probably watching a lot of content on YouTube, Instagram. There are a lot of content creators out there, and if you've been watching them, you probably might think it's all about that wet on wet, and that is a really good method and technique to be employing in your watercolors, but if that's all you stick to, you're going to be pretty frustrated. You're going to discover really quickly that it's just going to be a big fuzzy mess at the end of your effort. There's more. There's actually 4 more states of watercolor. Not just wet on wet. You also have wet on dry, dry on wet, and dry on dry. You work those 4 combination of stages and steps, and you're going to have a much better end result with your watercolor. So I'll show you the steps and stages of the paper, the brushes, and the mixture of pigment and saturation that you're going to be putting onto the paper. And if you follow these steps and stages, you're going to be just fine. You're going to have a lot of success. It'll be a lot of fun. So let's get started. The 4 states of watercolor are wet on wet, wet on dry, dry on dry, and dry on wet. So I'm going to prep a nice little example here on this little sheet of paper. And the first state I'm going to work with is wet on wet. And I'm going to make a little space on this paper here with just water, clear water, not tinting or doing anything to the surface. And if you look, I've got a nice, wet, glistening surface. You can even see the sheen on the paper. And when you're doing these various states, the states are related to the degree of wetness or dryness of the paper and the amount of wetness or dryness in the brushes, and then also the amount of saturation of your pigment that you're going to be applying to the space that is wet. So you really don't want a real soppy, lots and lots of water in the paper at this point. So it's drying, it's starting to lose its sheen. So you're just always gauging how wet your surface of your paper is. And with the wet on wet technique, I have a fairly saturated puddle of pigment here, probably about a tea coming into a coffee consistency, a thickness. So there's a lot of pigment in there. And that's one of the problems I see students working with, is they never saturate and get enough of a puddle in their palette before they get started. So I'm just going to drop in a color onto that area that I had wetted down on the paper. If you notice, there's a nice fuzzy edge right along this edge over here, and then this is a very sharp edge right here, and that's because that is where the wet stopped. It's like a force field, a barrier. It's like the Starship Enterprise. This threw up its shields and nothing can penetrate or go beyond that border right there. Over here it's nice and soft and fuzzy, and this technique is used a lot in establishing your base colors on a watercolor. You're just trying to block in all the colors. It doesn't matter. They can flow together. They move and come together. And as it dries, as it's wet, you can do all sorts of stuff with it, right? And you can create a nice, consistent, even tone in there. And even, I'm just going to get a little more clear water with another brush. There's Mr. Bead right there. We can even introduce that wetness and let it pull on down, so you can even create a gradient going from the color down to a lighter tone. All right, so it's all soft and fuzzy and wet on wet. Now wet on dry, which you got a preview of it right there. This is dry paper right here, and I've got a wet brush, a loaded brush. And if I were to you know, I could tap out color. Let me try it. There we go. See there? It's got enough pigment in it that I can tap it out. And when it's wet, all of that stuff just kind of melds together. You can get some nice textural effects like that. And then wet on dry is a very similar thing in that you're starting out with dry paper, so everything you're putting down within that shape is contained within the border of the stroke. So there's no fuzzy edges in here. Now there is that wet on wet movement happening inside the shape. And get another brush here. I'm going to introduce another color here. Let me get a red. I'm going to get some red going here. I'm going to mix up a little puddle of red. Get a good saturated red. There we go. Oh, got a little blue in it, so it's going to be a little of a dark red. Kind of a red violet. All right. So it's still damp up here. It's still damp here. And I'm getting another wet on wet mixture going. And I'm just going to drop in some red into that space. And just touch it in. And it's wet in there, so that edge, even though you can see where the stroke, it was a vertical or a horizontal stroke there, it's going to be a nice soft one right there. And if I can see, this is drying. This has it's almost dry. We got still a damp spot in here. I wouldn't mess with that one too much. But as long as you have that bead right there, that's a live edge. So we can still do something with that. We can even come back in with that wet water, that clear water, and just kind of touch in here and let that pull down. And you can get some cool effects and some nice gradients. There we go. And it just is going to keep softening and flowing down. And as it's still damp, you can always do things with it and get even more red in there. Let's say you didn't like that initial stroke right in there. It's wet, it's damp, you can still do stuff with it. It's manipulatable at this point. That looks like crap. Let's just come in. We'll just kind of pick it up and lift it out. And we're going to create that nice little soft transition to a lighter red to a pink. And all it takes is some water. So crisp edges, now we're softening them up just by adding and introducing water into where we had added all that fun stuff. All right, so you just don't want to overwork it too much. All right, so that's wet on wet, wet on dry with a wet on wet color transition inside it. So you can kind of see there's a mixture of relying on the various things, the techniques. They interact, they interlap. Now, this is actually good for big shapes if you have big brushes, and you're always wanting to work with as big a brush as possible. I've got 1 and 3/4 inch brushes. I also flats, I have rounds, and this is also, the wet on dry is also the detail state. So after a wash is dried, you can come in with a fairly saturated mixture consistency of pigment on dry paper, and you can, this is the state where you are working your detail. That mark is a very important thing. It won't travel, it doesn't get fuzzy. If you want a fuzzy mark, a fuzzy edge, you need to find a spot where it's still wet, and we'll introduce that mark into a wet area. And you can see the difference, a nice crisp, sharp, saturated line versus a softer, fuzzier, and it's going to be a less intense line when you paint into a wet area. So this is wet on dry, and this is wet on wet again. And then our last one would be to I'm going to take that brush and I'm going to unload the pigment from it. So it won't drip anything. There's pigment in it, but I just touched a paper towel and dried it out. And I'm going to make a dry brush right here. And this is where you can add textures into your paintings by simply loading a brush up with pigment, unloading it with a paper towel, and just stroking it in. And it's about the marks you're going to be making, and it creates a lot of nice effects. Okay, so that's dry on dry. We've had wet on dry and wet on wet, and now we need a wet into dry. I'm sorry, a dry into wet. And I'm going to use a smaller flat brush, just a damp brush. I'm going to unload it. There's no moisture that I can flick out of it. I take that back. I was on the handle though. All right, so this is a dry brush. It's damp, but there's no pigment or excess water in it. And I'm going to come in, and you can reactivate a dried area with that's a wet brush, a damp brush into this, and create some drawings there. And it's still wet down here. Here, I got one other thing right here. I'm going to add another field here. All right, so we're going to lay down, and this is a very saturated little square of color. And when it's wet like that, we can come in with a damp brush, unload it, and now it's a dry brush, and we can start affecting a dry and wet thing. This is the technique that a lot of clouds are kind of born in watercolors. So wet field with a dry brush, it lifts the pigment out of the shape. Okay, so that's kind of fun. And again, we can use a dry brush, no pigment, and we can come in. This is still damp. It's almost dry, but it still has some moisture in it. And again, we can lift pigment. We can even fix problems. Let's say I don't want that sharp edge right there. I'm just going to come in. I'm going to reintroduce. I'm going to get a bloom there, but I'm going to scrub it out. And I'm just introducing a lot of water in there. There we go. I'm going to pull that excess off, and I'm just going to try to lift out and make a little shorter block right there. So more water. This is kind of a correcting technique. So clear water, reactivating, lifting, cleaning the brush, lifting the pigment off the paper. It doesn't go back to a completely white state, but it's enough to fix a problem. Let's say I want a little shape up here. I'm going to put a little triangle right there. So we can kind of fix, for instance, that might be a peak on a horizon, or a roof line on a house that I didn't get in when I first added that color in there. All right. So that is how you can also fix problem areas with the washes that you're laying down. Wet on wet, wet on dry, dry on wet, and some corrective measures. And there's a wet on dry mark making. That's your detail state. And then your dry on dry right there. So those are essentially the 4 states of watercolor. So if you're having trouble, you can't get any detail, you can't get any structure to it, you have to let these washes dry. And then you can come in and paint with the detail, the saturated colors. You're also mixing up, the colors that you're going to mix up have to have a lot of pigment or saturation, and you need puddles over here. So that's a fairly thin mixture right there right now. So that's about a tea to a coffee state right there. All right, and I'll mix up a little more. This is more of a coffee. And you keep adding more pigment into it, especially with if you have some tube paints, you can really go through the whole series of consistencies. So tea, coffee, milk. Am I into the milk stage? I'm getting there. It's getting a lot more saturated. And cream, you get an even thicker. There's even more pigment in there. That's probably still milk, right? And you get clear up to the butter state where you're actually taking the paint straight from the tube, no water or anything. You're using it straight out of the tube, and that has the most impact, saturation of color, and control with detail. That is a detail state of your saturation right there. So you can see this one was darker, this one's even lighter. So all right, so play around with all of these. This is the thing you have to do. Just play around with this so you know at what state all of these colors are starting to function. So you can just, and this is a feel here as well. So with a little pan set, it's a little more of a challenge to get that uber thick consistency. So you have to wet down your palette and make sure those colors are nice and saturated and ready for painting. Okay, and typically when you're starting to paint with detail, you are working with a cream state and moving into butter. So it's starting to dry there. So you can see now that that's dried over there, you have the ability to create really nice marks and lines that are totally different than when the surface was still wet. And this is where students have the most problem. They do not wait until the washes are wet before they want to start adding and drawing and working with their detail in here. And one final thing, you can kind of see watercolor is a translucent medium, and you can see the glaze, the blue glaze on top of the original strokes right there. So I've created a variation in the square that I painted just because that pigment was on the paper before I made that secondary mark. So, and again, if I wanted to, I can come in and maybe just kind of soften the edge between these two shapes just with water to create that soft transition from one shape to the other. No sharp edges. So it's always a matter of controlling the soft edge versus the sharp edge. Okay, start practicing with this. Okay, I hope that little tutorial helps and gives you a little information about making sure that you use all four states of watercolor, and the wet on wet, wet on dry, dry on dry, and oh god, dry on wet. Did I say that? I hope this video helps, and if you got any value out of what I was showing you, please give me a like, give me a comment, hit the subscribe button. Any support you can give me, I appreciate it. I want to continue making these videos and improving upon my skills as a filmmaker, so let me know how I'm doing. See you soon.